Okay, so I will be presenting on Chasing the Scream, the first and last days of the war on drugs. So the way that I'm going to move through this lecture is talking about the book a little bit, so providing a brief summary, and then moving on into the main points that I perceived Hari was making. And then I'm going to move into my thoughts, my reactions, and my feelings about the book and about the message. And then um, coming in with a brief conclusion. So, with this book in particular, it documents Hari's journey on learning about substance use and what we think we know about it. And even further, the war on drugs. If you're not familiar with the war on drugs, this is a campaign that started out in the United States and has stemmed over into different countries. And the war on drugs, people believed it had started in the 1960s, 1970s, where you had the federal government targeting racial ethnic minorities and people who were speaking out against the government. And they were suggesting that these folks who were racial ethnic minorities and who were speaking up against the government were using substances. Now, while that is part of the war on drugs, the war on drugs actually started out a lot earlier than that. If you've heard of the person Harry J. Anslinger, Harry J. Anslinger was in charge of basically regulating drugs in the United States. At that point in time, when he was appointed, it was legal to use substances. Marijuana was legal, and you had a lot of jazz musicians singing about marijuana and not only just singing, but making songs after consuming it. And Anslinger was promoting when there was this article that was found about a young Latinx man that killed his family members after ingesting marijuana. Anslinger took that and ran with it, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But after this, there was like this strong prohibition and regulation of substances. So basically, drugs were banned in the United States. And Anslinger basically was going around making it his job to regulate it. But more about that in the next slide. So that was when the war on drugs started. And what we have seen is some very adverse impacts. Talk about that a little bit later. And Hari's journey about learning about substance use and about the war on drugs leads him to uncover the damaging effects of it. Not only does he focus on the individual and interpersonal levels, so how people, at the base and how their relationships are impacted, but also what this is doing at the systemic level, coming from top down. So he explores a lot of the interconnected nature between these different levels and how they're associated with the war on drugs. So I gave you a little brief overview, brief spiel about the war on drugs. So now I'm going to move into the points. The first point that I got from this book was that the war on drugs is an unsuccessful campaign, especially in the United States. So taken together, how we handle drug policies and how we go about treatment for people with substance use is not appropriate and it's not working, and we're not we're not changing it. Um, so why is it unsuccessful? Well, it's actually rooted in misinformation. So um, I mentioned that account. Um, it's important to note that the person who killed his family members, they have um, a history of psychological concerns, and there's also family history as well. So Ainslinger took that account and said, "Look, this is what's going to happen if these people of color and these poor people are taking these substances, they become monsters and they're unstoppable, um, and they're going to come after your daughters, come after your sons, and they're going to burn down our towns." In essence, what he was using to promote stronger policies against substance use was racist and classist beliefs. So when we're looking at the way that the war on drugs started, it was very much rooted in misinformation and in fear. It's also unsuccessful because what we have seen is the promotion of the humanization of people with substance use disorders. So people who are conceptualized as addicts in particular. And I bring up the account of Marcia Powell. Marcia Powell, she was referenced in the book, and she died in the care of an Arizona prison facility. In essence, what happened is they put her in a cage, and in Arizona, it is extremely hot, and it's dry. And Marshall Powell um, made constant pleas for the guards to take her out, but they did not. Marshall Powell did die, and the autopsy reported that like her organs were cooked. There was an investigation that was made, and there was an investigation that was done, but none of the officers were charged in her death. And this is not the first time that people have been put in these cages, particularly people with substance use. Um, with folks with substance use disorders, um, who are considered as offenders, what what we have done is we've taken them to jail. We isolate them from people, and for those who are unfortunate to get a felony, we make it harder for them to engage in society. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to points 2 and 3. But the point is, when people get drug charges that result in felonies, they're not able to really connect in society. They're limited on what they can do, and then that creates further disconnection. So, hint, hint, I'll be talking about disconnection. We see an adverse impact on people at the base. So particularly what we have noticed is with the war on drugs, there's a substantial amount of drug-related deaths due to violence, due to drug trafficking, and overdoses. Now, when I mean people at the base, let me put that point up there. When I mean people at the base, what we have noticed, and Hari points this out very explicitly, is that it's occurring in the faces of people of color and poor people of color. So the areas that are predominantly of folks of color or poor people, that's who are seeing these effects. There's more cases of drug trafficking in those areas compared to places that are not places, but neighborhoods and communities that are predominantly rich and white. And Hari even talks about his own privilege, saying that because of the identities that he has, and that he, the ones that he holds, being white, being rich, being, cis, and so forth and so on, because of those identities that he has, he had the privilege of not being exposed to those things as well. And he makes it very explicit in his book. He's also made notes about the marginalization and exploitation of people at the base. So in these cases where drug trafficking and drug violence are in, also the cases where cartels are actually running the town, people have no choice but to do their best to live with it. So in essence, it's more about survival. It's more about choices. It's not about good choices. It's about you have this choice or this choice. In some cases, you've had people go into the cartels and doing the work. And in other cases, you've had people who are doing their best to live and not get involved, and only to some extent that they do get involved. And Hari actually talks about several accounts of people who have done their best to get justice, only to have died or to have been unsuccessful, or to have given up. So taken together, when we're looking at the war on drugs, it's a very unsuccessful campaign. It has created more harm than good. I do argue that the intentions that were started out with this campaign were good. However, with it being rooted in misinformation and resulting in dehumanization, marginalization, and exploitation, really just the oppression of racial ethnic minorities, poor folks, and those with the intersections of those identities. This campaign has created more harm than intended. Point number 2. So I mentioned disconnection. The second point that I got from Hari's book is that addiction is driven by disconnection. So how do we get there? So when we're looking at our society, we're very capitalistic. And within this society, there's this an increase in commercialization, and as a result, you see this overconsumption of goods. So you have people buying things that they think they need to feel happy, and then they don't feel happy. It's like throwing things into a black hole. It's going in, and where is it going? No one knows, but it's not filling it up. In the book, Hari makes explicit references that with us wanting to buy these different things, and us trying to have these connections with these goods, and moving away from connection with other people, authentic connection, this can result in people turning to other things to experience that connection, to experience something that allows them to feel warmth and feeling like they're being hugged. And in some cases, people turn to people may become addicted to sex. They may become addicted to gambling. They may become addicted to substances. The point is, with these addictions, and the way that Hari suggests that we conceptualize it, is bonding. People are bonding to these substances. There was a study that Hari mentioned, and it was called Rat Park Study. It was done by Bruce Alexander. This study basically featured two different conditions. So the mouse in condition 1 was basically given a jug of water, heroin laced water, and that was it. Maybe a little bit of food, but that was just predominantly it. Well, in this condition, the mouse overdosed every time. Every mouse overdosed every time. There was nothing in the cage. However, in the second condition, and we're going to move into it in point 3, they had like, not only the mouse wasn't by itself, it was like by like other mice. There was like a slide. There was a little wheel that goes ding, ding, ding. And there was like heroin laced water, and like there was regular water, and there was food. So the rat had like all these different other little rats to play with, and so forth and so on. And in that condition, the rat and the rats, other rats, barely touched that water, that heroin laced water. There was little overdoses. So looking at comparing the conditions 1 and 2, in condition 1, there was nothing there. There was no consumption. There was no, not consumption, but there was no connection. The rat was bonding to that water, that heroin laced water. And as a result, it overdosed. So moving into point number 3, it's highlighting the importance of connection. And Hari suggests that connection heals addiction. So where disconnection drives addictions and fuels it, connection heals it. So when we're looking at that study of Rat Park, the little rat had like friends and things. And if you think about it, that if we're applying that to humans, that does make sense. Just because, if we take, just because we might drink 2 glasses or we might get drunk off of wine, that doesn't result in us becoming alcoholics. And, if we think about it, that makes sense as to why people, if you're, and well, let me back up. So if you are likely, if you have friends, you have other connections, you have authentic connections, and you have the resources, right? The likelihood that you become, the likelihood that your symptoms develop into substance use disorders is less compared to someone who lacks connections, lacks authentic connections. So taken together with this book, I want to highlight another thing that Hari discussed, and it was about injection sites for people with substance use disorders. When there was connections that was found amongst those with substance use disorders, they listened to each other. They had friends. They had friends that they, agreed with, especially about their substance use. And then we noticed that particularly they got better. And then before they knew it, they started forming like their own little campaigns. And I get the main point that I'm trying to convey is the way in which we conceptualize addiction is wrong. Looking at it from a relational frame might be a way for us, I think, especially as counseling psychologists, to treat folks with substance use disorders. When we look at the way in which we have treated people with substance use disorders, in essence, we take that connection that we have with them and we threaten it, and we say, we put a condition on it. Hari mentions Intervention. If you've seen that show Intervention, you know what I'm talking about. But basically, if you're not aware, I'll give you a brief spiel. This show is where a person with a substance use disorder, their family members express their concern, and they all form together and they tell this person, hey, if you don't stop doing these substances, we're gone. So they take that relationship that person has and they threaten it, and they put a condition on it and say, if you stop, we're here for you and we'll love you. But if you continue, we're not going to be here for you, and we're not going to love you anymore. That's a stretch, but that's in essence the message. And what we have seen is that um, intervention style programs like that, they're not effective. And the reason being is they're removing that connection, so it creates further stress amongst that person. So instead, Hari suggests that being with that person and saying, I'll be here for you no matter what. And Hari did make note that, a person, they may increase their dosage, they may engage in more behaviors, but eventually the cravings stop. And then that person doesn't, their symptoms lessen. So my thoughts on this book, I really enjoyed this book. There were a lot of moments where I cried, I reflected on my own biases, and for a long time I thought that I was not biased towards people with substance use disorders, and I thought I knew the way in which I would go about it. And if I had a person with an SUD face to face in my therapy room, and I've realized my own biases through reading this book. So the way that I maneuvered through this book is I've learned that the attitudes that we have towards people, it predicts how we're going to behave towards them. So as a therapist, honestly, as a counseling psychologist, and I think as a field, what we can do is challenge our biases towards people with SUDs and continue reflecting on that, being open and looking at the ways in which our research is is promoting connection, or is it promoting disconnection for folks with SUDs? I really enjoyed this book because of the exploration of systemic oppression through the war on drugs. From when I first learned about the war on drugs, I learned about it at Xavier. Xavier, if you don't know, it's an HBCU, and I've learned the ways in which the FBI attempted to target people of the Black Panther Party and so forth and so on, and target racial minorities, and that it stopped. However, with reading this book, it showed me that I'm wrong, and how connected the interconnected nature of different systemic oppressions. So the ways in which racism intersects with classism, as well as with heterosexism, so forth and so on. So this book does a lot of that, and I really appreciated that lens from Hari. I've also learned that language is really important. When we think about people with SUDs, right? There's language that can promote and further that disconnection, and continue to perpetuate that oppression, that stigmatization of people with SUDs. So when we think about the word like addicts, while I have my own concerns with calling people with SUDs addicts, I think it's important to remember that they are people too, and providing them space, providing their voice to reclaim that word. So taken together, also And the way in which we say certain things. So going back to Harry Anslinger, this promotion that people who were addicts were abominations and that they were coming after your sons and daughters. If you're looking at it, it's very, very broad and very, very vague. But because he also played on people's racial biases and fears, that led people to associate people of color and poor people with substance use and drugs and so forth and so on. So taken together, language is really important. This book has shown me, like, it has reinforced to me the importance of being careful with your language and being mindful. And then lastly, collaboration and connection is really, really important if we're wanting to make a social change. We know that the war on drugs is not working, and we know that it's fueling this connection between peoples. And because we know that addiction is driven by this connection, we can also know, we know that connection and collaboration can result in healing and really changing the war on drugs, and really our policies towards people with substance use. Hari made note of a lot of different avenues that people have taken to address the address the social changes and the ways in which we treat people with SUDs. And I think, I don't want to spoil it for you, but Switzerland is doing this, is doing the thing. Also Vancouver. I really encourage folks to read this book. It's an eye-opening book, and it's also I'd read it again, because of how powerful it is. And I think as counseling psychologists, if we're working for that social change, let's continue to challenge our biases. And let's also find the ways in which we can foster connection amongst people and really work to eliminate oppressions, as well as heal people with, with SUDs, and just healing them as people instead of seeing them as products. So in conclusion, right, this book basically says the way that we're treating substance use is wrong. Even further, it says what we think we know about substance use is wrong. The chemical imbalance theory is not holding up with the literature, and we ought to do something different. And that one way in doing that is by collaborating and providing connections for people with substance use disorders. I also have some information about Tiffany Smith. Tiffany Smith was a young girl who died in drug-related violence. She was a 6-year-old girl, and she got caught in a crossfire. And Marsha Powell, I also have some information about her as well. I'll also be providing some other information about other studies as well. That's it.